There were numerous Victorian workhouse scandals in England that exposed the harsh reality, conditions and mistreatment of the poor under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. They were meant to provide relief to the destitute, but they became infamous for their cruelty, overcrowding, neglect, and sometimes profiteering. The origins of the workhouse can be traced back to Tudor times, when a statute in 1388, called the Old Poor Law, where each parish raised funds from local landowners. It also attempted to address labour shortages following the Black Death in England by restricting the movement of workers, and ultimately led to the state becoming responsible for the support of the poor. An act in 1601 made parishes legally responsible for the care within their boundaries for those who are unable to find work, and they eventually formed unions to share the costs. As the population grew, increasing by 2/3 to almost 15 million by the mid-1800s, more people became dependent on parish relief, and the ratepayers began to complain about the costs, and increasingly lower levels of relief were provided. Mass unemployment had followed the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. The workhouse system had evolved in the 17th century, allowing parishes to reduce the cost to ratepayers providing poor relief. It put the number of parish workhouses in England and Wales at more than 1,800, which is about one parish in 7, with a total capacity of more than 90,000 places. The introduction of mechanical threshing machines, which could do the work of many thousands of agricultural workers in particular, together with a series of bad harvests and the potato blight famine across Europe, meant that by the early 1830s, the established system of poor relief was proving to be unsustainable. Farm labourers faced the approaching winter of 1830 with dread. By 1834, some authorities hoped to run workhouses at a profit by utilising the free labour of their inmates doing menial jobs. Those entering a workhouse might join anywhere from a handful to several hundred others. For instance, between 1782 and 1794, Liverpool's workhouse accommodated around 1,200 men, women and children. The larger workhouses served as many as 50 parishes. Writing in 1854, Poor Law Commissioner George Nichols viewed many of them as little more than factories. So keen were some authorities to cut costs wherever possible that cases were reported of husbands being forced to sell their wives to avoid them becoming a financial burden on the parish. In one such case in 1814, the wife and child of Henry Cook, who were living in Eppingham Workhouse, were sold at Croydon Market for 1 shilling. The parish paid for the costs of the journey and a wedding dinner. By the 1830s, most parishes had at least one workhouse, but many were badly managed. Many suspected that the system was being widely abused. Inevitably, there were notable and infamous scandals, one of which was at the Andover Workhouse in Hampshire that was laid bare in 1845. It stands as one of the darkest chapters in the history of England's poor law system. It exposed the inhumanity, mismanagement and neglect rampant in workhouses, and the revelations shocked Victorian society to the core and spurred reforms. At the Andover Workhouse, residents were subjected to grueling work in exchange for meagre food and basic shelter. It was administered by what was called a master, by the name of Colin MacDougall, and his wife, whose actions triggered the scandal. It became notorious due to the appalling conditions, mismanagement and abuse. There was starvation and inhumane work conditions, and the inmates were forced to crush rotting animal bones to produce fertilizer, a degrading and physically demanding task. They were so desperately hungry that they resorted to eating the marrow and scraps of gristle adhering to the bones that they were assigned to crush. People described this gruesome behaviour as a testament to the starvation they endured. MacDougall was a cruel and abusive individual who exploited his power over those he was responsible for. For example, inmates including women and children were beaten or denied food as punishment, and they were regularly humiliated and berated. MacDougall and his wife were accused of embezzling funds meant for the care of workhouse inmates, further depriving them of food and essential supplies. Allegations of sexual abuse were levelled against the master, who was said to prey on the female population. The Poor Law Commissioners, tasked with supervising workhouses, failed to investigate earlier complaints about the conditions in Andover. Local officials and visiting magistrates were either complicit or negligent in reporting the abuses. In February 1845, Hugh Munday, one of the Poor Law Guardians elected by the town of Andover, raised at the weekly meeting of the Board of Guardians rumours that paupers set to work to crush animal bones to produce fertilizer were in the habit of chewing on them. The board discounted the rumours, but Munday persuaded a few of the doubters to accompany him when he interviewed some of the residents. A dozen or so confirmed the story. They said that they fought each other for the bones if they were fresh, but they were so hungry that they ate the marrow even when the bones were putrid. Munday had urged a subsequent board meeting to report the bone gnawing to the Poor Law Commission and asked for an inquiry, but this was rejected. In August, he wrote to the two local MPs, asking them to raise the matter in Parliament and call for an inquiry. An official by the name of Parker was sent to Andover to investigate. He took a sworn statement from Munday, then held an inquiry on the workhouse premises. It was not held behind closed doors, but it was not publicised. The following week, the Hampshire Advertiser reported that the inquiry had taken place, but its result was not yet made known. Further accusations followed rapidly, and the Times and the Evening Mail reported that the August meeting of the Andover Union Guardians had heard allegations that the workhouse master had failed to supply sick paupers with the dietary extras ordered by the medical officer and had been diverting workhouse provisions for his own profit. Parker returned to Andover to hold hearings on these further charges. After agreeing that the inquiry would be held in public, he adjourned proceedings for a week to give the master, who remained in his post, time to prepare his defence. Thomas Westlake, the medical officer who had made these accusations, wrote to the Poor Law Commission, making yet further allegations that MacDougall, the master, had frequently taken liberties with the younger women and girls, by force or otherwise, to consent to gratify his wishes, and was guilty of drunkenness and other immoralities. Parker would only hear evidence of residents not getting what they should. There was evidence of pigs being fed potatoes, which were paupers' rations, which, he said, was irrelevant. After 11 days of hearing prosecution witnesses, it was announced that no new cases or witnesses would be heard, even though there were still over 100 yet to be heard, and it would take 3 months to hear them all. The following day, the hearing was suspended completely, following a letter to Parker from the Poor Law Commission. What did come out was that the inquiry had uncovered much damning evidence. The diet provided to inmates was far below the standards of decency, leading to severe malnutrition. The McDougalls were found guilty of gross misconduct, including physical and sexual abuse of the inmates, and the inquiry revealed that the Poor Law Commissioners had completely failed in their oversight duties, allowing the abuses to continue unchecked. The scandal had significant ramifications for the poor law system and Victorian society, and it amplified criticism of the system, leading to demands for better oversight and reforms in workhouse conditions. Inspections of other workhouses were tightened, although many issues and abuses persisted. The commissioners, who had been dismissive of earlier complaints, faced severe criticism. Their credibility suffered, prompting a push for more transparent administration. The rations set by the local guardians were less than the subsistence diet laid down, and it was found that the master of the workhouse was diverting some of the funds and food for private gain. The guardians were reluctant to lose his services, despite the allegations of his drunkenness on duty and sexual abuse of female inmates. The McDougalls were removed from their positions and publicly disgraced. A replacement was recommended, but newspapers pointed out that he had resigned as master of a workhouse elsewhere whilst under investigation, and was advised to withdraw his application forthwith. This particular scandal highlighted the systemic cruelty of workhouses and fueled broader calls for social reform. Writers like Charles Dickens, who was concerned by such events, captured public sentiment in novels such as Oliver Twist, critiquing the dehumanizing treatment of the poor. The whole episode remains a symbol of the failure of the Victorian workhouse system, and stands as a grim reminder of how poverty was criminalised and how the most vulnerable members of society were subjected to these indignities. The horrific conditions at Andover came to light through persistence of whistleblowers and public outcry. Testimonies from former residents exposed the starvation and abuse. The press played a crucial and important role in bringing the scandal to national attention, sparking justifiable concerns with the public across England. The overall pressure forced the government of the day to investigate the allegations formally and progress reforms to the system. There were many other outrageous scandals that came to light. For instance, the one at the Huddersfield Workhouse in 1848. The events at the establishment highlighted the failures of medical care in workhouses in general, among other things, leading to calls for reforms. Problems included overcrowding, disease, food and sanitation. High death rates and unsanitary conditions in the workhouse caused outrage with the public. A doctor was accused of failing to provide adequate care, and the conditions were described as inhumane. A report described the workhouse as completely unfit for occupation for the many people that continually crowded into it, unless that there was a desire to engender endemic and fatal diseases. It was claimed that the Huddersfield Workhouse was by far the best in the area. On investigation, the conditions were considered to be worse than those in Andover, which had hit the headlines in Britain 2 years earlier. Both of these incidents contributed to the growth of demands for social change. Then there was the Bridgewater Workhouse scandal in 1856. The conditions there were hellish, and numerous inmates died in a cholera epidemic. It was brought to public attention when a local newspaper described the place as a murderous pest house and posed the question, is killing in a workhouse criminal if sanctioned by the Poor Law Commission? Many had also died from dysentery caused by a change to a cheaper diet. An elderly inmate named Mary Parsons, it was claimed, had been severely beaten by the workhouse master. The governors of the establishment congratulated the workhouse chairman for saving £4,843. It was revealed that food and clothing were being withheld from inmates. The master was eventually dismissed after a public outcry. In 1865, at the Greenwich Workhouse, orphaned and destitute children were found to be poorly fed and inadequately clothed, despite funds allocated for their care. They were sent out to work under dangerous conditions, without proper oversight. 2 years later, in Stockport in 1867, Anne Broadbent, an inmate, died from neglect after being left in a filthy, overcrowded ward without proper medical attention. Witnesses at the inquest described starvation, abuse, and appalling hygiene standards. A mob of as many as 20,000 unemployed workers attacked the workhouse in search of food. In speeches to the mob, the leaders of the protesters blamed the present state of the poor and unemployed on the government and the Church of England and its bishops. They turned out the workers from mills and printworks, and with their increased numbers extorted money from both mill owners and shopkeepers before attacking the new Union Workhouse, where they stole food and a considerable amount of copper coins. A government force composed of constables, yeomanry and regular infantry put down the mob and captured the 40 leaders, who were sent for trial 6 months later at Chester Assizes. These events further fueled demands for stricter inspections and reforms. Some unions opted to send destitute children to the British colonies, in particular to Canada and Australia. Known as Home Children, the philanthropic farm school alone sent more than 1,000 boys to the colonies between 1850 and 1871, many of them taken from workhouses. In 1869, Maria Rye and Annie Macpherson, who were described as two spinster ladies of strong resolve, began conveying groups of orphans and children from workhouses to Canada, most of whom were taken in by farming families in Ontario. The Canadian government paid a small fee to the ladies for each child delivered, but most of the cost was met by charities. Available data today surrounding death rates within the workhouse system is minimal at best, but it is estimated that 10% of those admitted after the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act died within the system. On the 24th of January 1918, the Daily Telegraph reported that the local government committee on the Poor Law had prepared a report recommending abolition of the workhouses and transferring their duties to other organisations. As of 1997, when the research was done, it was found that around 10% of the British population had a genealogical connection to the workhouse system.